We associate those typical 80s sounds, drum machines, high-pitched synthesizers, sunny disposition, with pop music, with singles, with as far as albums concerned, you imagine these groups, these sort of acts would have maybe 3 attempts at a hit single on the album and the rest is just filler. But what if this sound was experimented within an art pop / serious art pop context? Well, that's how I've always felt about Genesis's Abacab. It's kind of astonishing to me that what we have is not a split from an art pop rock / progressive rock / whatever you want to refer to it as, more sophisticated, classy sort of music. Even Duke preserved... It added art pop whilst preserving the art rock. But Abacab was even more a step into art pop. Although, if we look at it, listen to it closely, it really is another art rock experiment. It is delving into the art pop more, as Duke was. But it's still thoroughly Genesis engaging in a kind of experimental rock. I would insist. Them throwing the styles at the wall, seeing what works. It's Genesis jamming out what they're in the mood to jam and coming up with a creative result. It is still thoroughly this, in my view. To my ears, anyway. We can debate over the nature of the self-titled in 1983 and Invisible Touch in 1986. By 1991's We Can't Dance, I'm out. That's just absolutely terrible, to be honest. But Abacab, I would insist, is one of Genesis' most interesting albums, to be honest. It could be easy to dismiss this album as an attempt by Genesis to float out a bunch of pop or new wave oriented material out there for the masses to consume and kind of reinvent themselves, disguise their past to a newer listener for the new decade. Although, I actually think that this was rather an attempt to dress themselves in the 80s, but then still create a thoroughly Genesis listening experience. One wherein you kind of lean your head into the speaker and just kind of absorb everything that's happening as though you're watching a film. The great experience of listening to a mighty Genesis album, a Genesis classic, that's still going on here in my opinion. I think they capture that quality. Let me go through the track list and elaborate upon why I feel this way. Title track. Opening track. Abacab is a classic. Now, forget or accept Phil's vocals. They are what they are. Yes, this album, Abacab in particular, Genesis onward, suffers. Abacab is the first album to come out after Face Value. Phil Collins' debut solo album was a smash success. As a result, Genesis's albums are inflicted with being burdened with Phil Collins' concurrent, highly successful, more successful solo career. That is what it is. We're just gonna have to learn to accept that, because the Phil Collins solo albums inspire a certain anguish in many, and I can understand it to some extent. And if that puts one off of these Genesis albums, then so be it. Although I would insist that there's more going on there than just what you hear on No Jackal Cried or But Seriously, or whatever you want to name. But by the time the second half of the song kicks in, it's just this purely instrumental guitar licks and keyboard stabs dueling each other. It's pure Genesis. It's Genesis entering a new era, and it sounds like the band that have existed, well, the power trio version of Genesis that formed with, and then they were free, but really solidifies itself with Duke and is moving further into the new era with Abacab. I would argue with the 83 album they regress and create essentially kids' music rather than... They eschew the experimentation that was the pop stylings and just go for the basic kind of saccharine pop stylings on 83. 83 is the true pop reinvention rather than Abacab, in my opinion. Given that it was a self-titled album, I think that was saying everything that needed to be said, in my argument. Now let's move on, after we're a big fan of that opening track. That's just classic. That second half is that's great art rock / prog. Come on. And then there's No Reply at All. An Earth, Wind and Fire track, what sounds like. It's amazing. It's one of the best Genesis songs up to this point. Is anybody listening? Oh, no reply at all. It's one of the finest pop arrangements of the 1980s. However, this song is burdened with having that horrible way deep and down inside I'm lying. that horrible. Ugh. If Ace Value hadn't been a success, that the song might not have existed. So that's unfortunate. The Phoenix Horns, Earth, Wind and Fire's horn section, who play on the song, were the horn section for Face Value, the solo album, Phil Collins. That horrible section, Tony and Mike would have said, Phil, take that out. That I sing slightly better than Phil Collins on that track, believe it or not. No, I hate that bluesy Phil Collins thing he started doing, that blue-eyed soul thing he starts doing Face Value on, because he's not singing like that on Duke. He still sounds like a Peter Gabriel impersonator on Duke. And then he starts doing this horrible wannabe bluesy kind of raspy thing. Advertising for a bit. It's crap. You don't need it. But otherwise, No Reply at All is a phenomenal track. Not taking anything away from it. Well, I am a little bit, but not too much, if I don't have to. Me and Sarah Jane is okay. If it was a 4-minute song, I might like it more. And I love the arrangements on the song, but it's hard to appreciate when there's no ultimate, hook to look forward to in the song itself. That's what ultimately I find a bit disappointing about Me and Sarah Jane. It kind of goes nowhere. I can appreciate the tapestries, although there's just no substance there, unfortunately. It reminds me of a track on a Tony Banks solo album, and I really, really like A Curious Feeling, and I really like The Fugitive as well. But it reminds me of a track on those albums that kind of has very pretty, very well produced, well arranged, but ultimately doesn't go anywhere, because Tony Banks was not he had the clear capacity to be a great pop songwriter, although he needed Mike and Phil there, or whomever, Peter, to assist him out with that. I mean, he composed the song A Trick of the Tail, which is pop, wannabe Beatles genius in a way, wannabe Syd Barrett and whatever you want to say. But man, Bankstatement's not. I kind of like Bankstatement, but the Still album is horrible. Ugh. Anyway, moving on from that. Keep It Dark is godly. Keep It Dark. This is one of the best Genesis songs of all time. If you need to sell someone on 80s era Genesis, play them this song. It's phenomenal. It's a pure art rock track, and it got MTV airplay. I mean, this has got a fairly iconic music video. Well, I think iconic. I wasn't around at the time. People from the 80s, you tell me what music video is iconic and what isn't, because I don't freaking know. You tell me. The Scary Monsters and the music video is the one I like the most. David Bowie. Also Avalanche Since I Left You, but that's a given. That is a given. And I like that clip of Magical Mystery Tour where the Beatles are walking down the stairs in synchronization to Your Mother Should Know. That's pretty nice. I like that. But then after Keep It Dark, we have Dodo Lurker. Dodo Lurker is just classic Genesis. It sounds like it's from 1981, but it sounds like classic Genesis are playing within 1981. Now, Genesis could pretend that 1973 never ended for the rest of time. They were certainly doing so in 1976, and I appreciate that they did that. They were pandering to the old fans for a couple of albums there, on Trick of the Tail, for no other reason, just to prove that he could still do it, and make a kind of conservative album by comparison to The Lamb. Wind and Wuthering kind of continues the experimental structures, the sonic soundscapes of Lamb's a bit more. Wind and Wuthering is absolutely amazing. And so I find it very disappointing when you hear old school Genesis fans complaining about when Hackett left, there's no note density, so it's not good. It's just like, grow more brain cells, It's like the actual smarty pants for listening to prog in the first place, but it's like, you do realise that, like, not all pop music, not all 80s music is inherently bad. It's like, it was really just the note density was all you cared about, because a lot of the old school prog fans still claim that the 70s prog albums are the best. Well, prog albums have come out since then. Fusion albums have come out since then with more note density. So it obviously wasn't about note density. Maybe it was about a good song with great modern production. Modern, at that time, high fidelity. And Genesis were mostly, maybe not 83 onward, but Genesis were following the same creative impulses they were following on The Lamb and on Trick of the Tail and on Wind and Wuthering. I'm telling you now, they would have had to have acted conservative or different in order to preserve the old sound. That's all, you know. Who Dunnit is pretty awesome. Was it you or was it me? Or was it he or she? No, no. So who's responsible for New Wave? Was it you or was it me? Or was it XTC? No, did it. Now, Man in the Corner. This is like something off of a bad Phil Collins solo track. A slow... I actually don't mind Phil Collins solo songs when they're up-tempo. They can be kind of derivative of other artists, namely Prince or Earth, Wind and Fire, or even Michael Jackson, actually. But nevertheless, I think they can be pretty fun, you know. When they turned the Behind the Lines track into a Jackson 5 song, I missed again. A lot of the production on Hello I Must Be Going. I even don't mind that silly... the Phil Spector cover, You Can't Hurry Love. It's so stupid, and like Phil shouldn't sing that, but I love the production sheen, that kind of Christmas music sheen. Or is it Christmas music sheen? But I like the first two free-ish Phil albums, but I hate the slower tempo songs are so boring and uncharismatic. They have no character, no life to them, no personality, no storyline, nothing. Just a somber blank canvas. You can put any old sad, boring story onto it. It's just pathetic. And Man in the Corner is just another one. Man in the Corner is the weakest cut on this album. I love the production, percussion, and all of that. The production on Abacab in general. I love the Hugh Padgham sound. I just do. A lot of people despise it now. I really, really like it. I think it sounds great. I love the precision. I love following everything with headphones when I listen to Abacab. Phenomenal. Just an absolutely engrossing, engaging experience. But a lot of the actual song, like in the context of this song as a piece of written music being played live, yeah, not very good in my opinion. When I say written music, you know what I mean, as a interesting or creative melody. I'm not talking about, you know, octaves and stuff. I don't know. I've established that before. And I'm very clearly establishing that again by saying things like that. Like It or Not is really good. I like this track a lot. I like the mood. I like the melancholy. I like the tempo. I like the production stylings. It's good stuff. I think it's if there could be a slower tempo Phil Collins driven 80s song which could be really good, it's this one. Because this one, there's conviction to this song, and there is something going on in the arrangement to this song. There is a slight change of time signature, I think. Now I'm trying to... why am I trying to talk about this now? I just said I wasn't going to. Let's go to the last track. Another Record. Terrific little song. I love the track's philosophic disposition. The lyrical suggestions here. Phenomenal. You know, so what do? It's very meta. You just sit around, you know, you've had all this idealism, all these dreams as a young man. Now you're an older man. How much of a cool, hip, young guy can you be when you're over the age of 30? Certainly 35. Well, what made you feel so cool and alive in the first place? What made life worth living? Well, my record collection, or just records in general. Now they're amassed in my record collection. I'm 30-something, got all 40-something, got all my records here. Look at that. Wait a minute, what was my life ideals? It wasn't just to build up the record collection. That was just supplemental because life was good, so I wanted records to, you know, celebrate the fact. But eventually life just became about buying records. And just, you know, curating my record collection. You know, I mean, I thought life was going to be exciting like what the rock groups sing about. You know, I thought I was going to have an exciting life like Led Zeppelin or you know, traverse into a fantasy world like Genesis sings about, or live an exciting rough and tumble, you know, unpredictable life like any number of rock or pop acts, you know, sing about. Not just as a, you know, just minor distraction, escape from the mundanity. Oh. And even if you do live in a big mansion, big lakeside manor, boats and a wharf, there's some nice water. At the end of the day, I just want to kick back, look through my record collection. Look, Abacab. That's a good album. I'm going to listen to Abacab through my hi-fi surround sound speaker system setup. And I'm just going to think about it, listen to it, think about it as a piece, and then justify in my head, yep, that's a good purchase. That falls under the rules of a great album. Wonder what other albums are in my collection that I need to re-justify the purchase of. I haven't listened to in a while. It's like the record collection starts existing for its own sake, and not because it was a memento of, prospective life ideals, experiences, and dreams. Damn. What do we do now? I don't know. Let's just put another record on, I guess. Something to do, right? Genesis decided that even though it was 1981 and they were expected to have a 1981 sheen, and they did, they accepted the challenge. We can still sound like ourselves within a 1981 sheen. Forget the fact that Phil Collins has a solo career. Forget the fact that these sound like 80s pop hooks, especially at the start of Abacab. If you really don't like the key tones of Tony, if you really just hate 80s sounds that much, then there's not much I can do to help you here. But if you do appreciate 80s pop, as the 2010s has come to, claim is not so lame a thing after all, and you also appreciate old school art rock and prog from the 70s, then you look at Abacab as an example of, a bit like Yes on 90215 or whatever that album's called, just a kind of an improper, lazy, and cynical stab at that genre just to make money after drama doesn't work out. An amazing Yes masterpiece which no one cared for, so they had to resort to utter garbage on 90215. Yeah, I like Owner of a Lonely Heart. Changes is okay, but the rest of that album has always disappointed the heck out of me, because I love prog bands experimenting with 80s technology. I think Yes are the only one of the major prog bands that did it poorly, other than Gentle Giant, but I don't even know if that counts, because that was recorded in the 70s, that terrible Civilian hard rock album. It's not really an 80s sound, it's a mainstream hard rock sound of 1980 on the dot. Not really an 80s sound as we know it, when we think of Moving Pictures by Rush, King Crimson's Discipline, or Jethro Tull's A and Under Wraps, or Genesis on Duke and Abacab, and self-titled, And it still sounds like Genesis to me. You know what? Duke and Abacab sound a lot more like Genesis to me than And Then They Were Free, which was deliberately trying to not sound so much like Genesis in order to get some radio airplay. Although, they figured that some of the tracks on there, like Follow You, Follow Me, which did make a bit of a mark in the United States, that track clearly did have Genesis idiosyncrasy about it, and so they figured they'd amp up the Genesis idiosyncrasy in that context, in that kind of more compact pop format, which is succeeding like hell with some of the hits on Duke and those hits on Abacab. And compositionally, as an album listening experience, it really assisted in making all the tracks interesting and not just prospective, cuts to be played on a radio because they're under 4 minutes, on the case of And Then They Were Free, for an example. Yeah, Abacab is totally Genesis. There's a lineage here. It sounds like the band that I fell in love with, and then began to accept them as a quartet and prospective trio. I think it still works. It's still Tony Banks, it's still Phil Collins, it's still Mike Rutherford. They're still making this dynamic... It's a sound that's dependent on their virtuosity, whilst more dependent on an understanding of compact and effective pop melodies, because that's ultimately what's working in Genesis in between the great long suites. It's a intro to Firth of Fifth, it's a Willow's Farm on Supper's Ready, it's a breakdown in the middle of Colony of Slippermen, or a section or a solo section of In the Cage, which could have been a great enjoyable pop hook, but it's within the context of this great crescendo. These enjoyable facets are always present within the classic Genesis. It's just they're hidden within the great progressive rock epics, which, if I had a gun to my head, I prefer the classic lineup of Gabriel, Hackett, Tony, Phil, and Mike. Those 4 albums are the best. But Duke and Abacab are my next 2 favourites. Those are the next 2 most creative Genesis albums to me. As much as I absolutely love Shriek of the Tail, and especially the great Wind and Wuthering album. But forget that it's an 80s album. Think of it as a Genesis album. Gee, it sounds like 1981, but it also sounds like Genesis playing their sound within that paradigm, and beautifully so. I think it's one of the most interesting and evocative and stylistically imaginative of the Genesis discography. Just them working within those boundaries is absolutely arresting, really. To fly the flag of this album is quite an interesting cultural statement, though. Because Abacab didn't quite fall into this thing of, oh, cool retro 80s album. You know, you don't seem to have cred promoting Abacab as opposed to promoting your, I don't know, Japan's Tin Drum, John Fox's Metamatic, or, you know, The Cure's The Head on the Door, or even something by the Human League like Dare, even though Dare's a horrible album. I don't like the Human League that much in general. I don't hate synth pop by any means. I just, you know, the aforementioned albums I really like. I mean, those aforementioned albums all those albums of K-punk cred. Abacab by Genesis certainly does not have any K-punk cred, or much cred in the UK. Here's the thing. Genesis by Abacab were embracing America rather than the United States, much like the Police on album 3 or album 4. I'm not going to get into my opinion on the Police today, it's a bit odd, but I think you British fans started to reject the Police once they were clearly setting their sights for America, rather. Genesis were clearly doing that in Abacab. And then There Are Free still sounds distinctly English, as does Duke in its own way, but oh man, was... You know, there's a certain idiosyncratic British pop new wave about Sheen, about Duke, whereas Abacab is more of a Sunshine Miami sort of vibe about it. It's like they just got rich and decided to spend more time in sunny America rather than gloomy old England. The Genesis, so whenever these like British rock stars talk about how like lame and boring England is, and then how much more nice how much they wanted to live in like LA instead, I'm always kind of stunned. I'm just like, you know, I love watching old English, you know, media and the countryside and small cottages, villages. And so I'm always kind of stunned, like, you want to live in LA instead of that? It's like, I don't want to live there, I want to live in LA. It's like, you lived in England your whole life and you want us to live in America? That's insane to me. I don't know, man. I'm a weird Australian, like, my perspective is a bit off, I don't know. To reiterate the point I kind of started a bit earlier, it's hard to put Abacab in the context of cool Gen X sort of trendy, vaguely punk or post-punk pop-esque sort of synth pop. Because Genesis is more like a boomer band, or like a kind of a rock band with an album-oriented discography, where you listen to it and you kind of analyze the album and the production and it as a piece of a band's discography. It's less of a, up-tempo, punk-inspired piece of Gen X 80s music, and more of the boomers still buying records in the 80s music. And even though Phil Collins has been somewhat rehabilitated, I don't know if Genesis itself has. It's interesting. It's kind of bizarre to me, to be honest. Abacab is seen as more of a boomer indulgence album than a kind of Gen X woohoo, like let's break free and dress however we want and be stylish, sort of, and very 2010s, right? No wonder the 80s took off again as an aesthetic. You know, Abacab falls into the boomer more so than the Gen X. I mean, Genesis were boomers, they weren't Gen Xers. But they were making music that was meant to be appealing to Gen Xers and resembled a style that was appealing to Gen Xers, that kind of new wave synth pop sheen. I think they nail it. Probably because they still sound like boomer art rockers to me, and I think they do a beautiful job of composing boomer, listener-oriented art rock. Even though, you know, I love my synth pop as well. I love YMO, I love... Kraftwerk and Telex and, you know, good synth pop essentially. I don't really like the Human League or Depeche Mode that much, but OMD is a genius band, for example. Some of those albums are phenomenal. You know, New Order, Gary Newman and / Two Boy Army, especially more underground stuff such as Suicide, or, you know, the British minimal synth world of like Solid Space, Linear Movement, Ico, well they were Canadian, or Scottish groups like the Klingons. Some of the best music I've ever heard. Love 80s synthesizer stuff in general, to be honest. I have nothing... You know, Gen X stuff is amazing. So when I hear this kind of prog rock band, art rock group do that 80s new wave synth pop sound and nail it, I mean, how can I not be obsessed with Abacab? I think it's, you know, art rock meets Gen X synth pop, boomer music meets Gen X indulge. Like, that's fantastic. Abacab's such a beautiful meeting of worlds. I adore it, honestly.